Hi there, Phil here, and I'm from the AquascapeGuide.com. Guess what? We decided to create an entire series just on algae. So if you haven't already, check out the algae playlist on our YouTube channel. But in this episode, we're going to cover Staghorn algae. Before we get into things, I want to first start out by saying that 1, most algae can be corrected with weekly water changes with clean water, alongside a little tank maintenance. This includes a 50% water change weekly when there are no issues, and 75% weekly if there is an issue. The water change also includes removing any detritus or mold buildup in your scape, cleaning out your canister's pre-filter sponges, and every 2 to 3 months siphoning out the sludge in your aqua soil. Removing all this rotting organic matter prevents dissolved organic compounds from building up, thus preventing algae. And 2, we never suggest adding more livestock to act as a cleanup crew. Most algae present themselves due to an imbalance of organics in our tank. So adding little more poop factories to our tanks can sometimes further throw off that balance of our scape. And lastly, at ASG, we teach to focus on keeping your plants super happy, and they'll deal with the algae. When your plants are happy, they produce something called oleochemicals. These oleochemicals are a natural defense mechanism against algae. Happy, thriving plants means no algae. So if you have not already, make sure you go through the ASG University, or at minimum, our Part 1 playlist on YouTube. Okay, now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about the ins and outs of Staghorn algae. Don't worry, we've helped many hobbyists overcome this algae, so we've got you covered. The first thing I want to go over is how to identify this algae. So Staghorn is a stiff, spiky algae that generally develops on the edge of plants' leaves and hardscape. It can be easily mistaken for the dreaded blackbeard algae, or BBA for short, due to its fuzzy look. However, Staghorn algae is generally stiffer than BBA. It's also lighter in color at times. And Staghorn is much more spiky than BBA. The 3 most common reasons we see Staghorn pop up in our aquariums is due to excessive amounts of organics in our water, especially ammonia or nitrites. It can also be due to temporary instabilities or changes in your tank's water chemistry, like your GH or KH spiking or dropping suddenly. And lastly, just overall plant stress, so your plants aren't getting what they need. Since it's a little difficult to differentiate between Staghorn algae and BBA, let's talk a little bit more about that. So here's our little side-by-side example of the difference between BBA, which is on the left, and Staghorn, which is on the right. Notice how BBA looks softer, like flowing hair, where Staghorn looks spikier and more stiff looking. Part of the reason why these two are really easy to distinguish is because the algae is more mature, allowing us to see it in its full form, though it gets a little harder to discern when it's just starting out in our tanks. But here's another great example of the difference between BBA and Staghorn algae. In this example, there's both BBA and Staghorn growing on this leaf. The Staghorn is longer than the BBA, more string-like, and lighter in color, whereas the BBA is fuzzier, shorter, and darker in color. The reason we think it's important to diagnose the algae properly is BBA has a very different and specific root cause versus Staghorn. And if we try to treat Staghorn like BBA, it won't subside. Alright, now I'm sure there's a few of you that are like, shoot, I don't have Staghorn, I probably have BBA. If so, we've already developed a very extensive guide on blackbeard algae, or BBA. I'll put a link in the description below so you can jump over to that video and watch that. So now that you 100% know you have Staghorn algae, how do we treat this nasty stuff? As we will say in all of the videos, the methods that we are about to mention will not prevent Staghorn algae from coming back. It will just kill what you currently have in the tank. We'll address prevention after treatment. But here are a few ways you can treat Staghorn algae in your tank. The first is by treating it with hydrogen peroxide. If you can, we suggest you remove the affected plant or hardscape from the tank. Fill a squirt bottle with hydrogen peroxide that's around 3% in concentration, and then spray the affected area. Let it sit for 30 seconds, but don't let the plant dry out. We suggest to remove the affected areas from the tank so you can rinse it really well before putting it back into the aquarium. You can always spray the affected areas inside the tank during a water change while the water level is low, or if you're feeling feisty, use a syringe to hit the affected area if they are underwater still. But know that using too much hydrogen peroxide can kill livestock and more sensitive animals like invertebrates. This is why we suggest removing the affected plant or hardscape. Also, this will not dissolve the staghorn, but it'll just turn into another color, and that's how you know it's dead. If you haven't already, check out our guide to using hydrogen peroxide to treat your plants. We'll put a link in the description below. The next form of treatment is a bleach dip. This one's a little more aggressive. There is very little that can survive a bleach dip. Mix 1 part bleach to 20 parts lukewarm water. More sensitive plants like crypts dip for no longer than 90 seconds. Hardier plants like Anubis can be dipped for 150 seconds roughly. You're just not going to be able to dip mosses, and rinse any plant that was dipped really well with dechlorinated water after the dip session. A bleach dip will not dissolve staghorn, but again, turn it another color. If you're trying to save the affected leaf or area, we can then try to rub it off with our fingers. If rubbing it off doesn't work, you'll just need to trim the affected leaves over time. If it's on some sort of hardscape and you want to get rid of it, you can use a wire brush or a toothbrush to try to brush it away. Just make sure that you siphon out any little pieces that might be floating around. We want to remove as much of that as we can. And last but not least, Seachem Excel. Excel is a glutaraldehyde-based algaecide, and it's great for killing staghorn over time. Dose as directed, and you should see the staghorn turn another color, which means it's dead. Just know that glutaraldehyde can kill more sensitive plants like boosts or mosses, crypts, even if you use it as directed. So just keep an eye on your plants and what they're trying to tell you. Once the staghorn is dead, you can scrape it off your plants or the hardscape, or just trim out the affected areas. If you'd like to learn more about Seachem Excel and what it really is, you can check out our video on YouTube. We'll put a link in the description below. Now, if you don't want to use a dip solution, or a chemical like Seachem Excel, so long as you take preventative measures to ensure it doesn't come back, you can simply trim out the affected areas over time, and the staghorn algae should not come back. Okay, now that we got treatment out of the way, let's cover some preventative measures we can implement to prevent this algae from coming back. As stated in other videos, we need to make changes to how we are running our systems, otherwise the algae is just going to keep coming back. The definition of crazy is doing the same thing over and over, yet expecting different results. We do not want to rely on fish, algae eaters, snails, shrimps, etc. to fix a design flaw that we have introduced into our systems. Like, look at this little poor kid just screaming out for help. It's got a bunch of green spot algae on our leaves, holes due to lack of nutrients, and staghorn growing all over it. This is a great example of our tank telling us that we need to make some changes. And over time, we become more in tune with what our tanks are showing us. So to help prevent staghorn algae, the first thing I would suggest is testing for organics, specifically ammonia and nitrites. As you know, we're big fans of the API test kits, so if you've got one, bust out your ammonia or nitrite test kit and test your water. If you see any ammonia in your tank, that's the reason you're seeing staghorn algae. Staghorn loves its some ammonia. The reason why is it's a simpler compound. So plants, including algae, can uptake it as a macronutrient easier than a compound like nitrates. So where could this ammonia be coming from? One source we commonly see is from chloramines in a hobbyist tap water. Chloramines are a disinfectant that is created by mixing chlorine and ammonia. What happens is when we use a dechlorinator like Seachem Prime, which we're a big fan of, it will remove the chlorine from the water column, but then leaves the ammonia in the tank. Now, Prime will bind up the ammonia, but only for around 48 hours, from what Seachem has said. So after that 48 hours, you have free-floating ammonia floating around your water column. Another source of ammonia can be a temporary spike in your municipal tap water due to rain runoff. Now, this seems a little crazy, but when it rains after it hasn't for a really long time, all the junk on our streets gets washed into the municipal water supply, causing kind of a large spike in ammonia. And if you process a water change while we're getting all this runoff, there could be ammonia in your tap water. Now, it's not all the time, it's just something to be mindful of if you are using tap water. So now you're probably thinking to yourself, well dang, how do we get rid of the organics in our tap water? Now, we hate to say it, but the cleanest way to get around ammonia in your tap water is by using an RODI unit to remove the impurities in your water. Just make sure you remineralize it. Now, as much as we love RODI water, we're reluctant to suggest it because it complicates the water change process, to the point where some hobbyists start skipping water changes, and that can be an issue too, right? However, RODI water can be a game changer, especially for those with really hard water. If you're looking for a great, cheap little unit, we really suggest the RO Buddy by Aquatic Life. We'll put a link in the description below. Now, another way we can address ammonia in our water column when we have it in our tap water is through chemical filtration. Now this isn't as great of an approach as RODI water for a couple of reasons. The first one, it takes time for the chemical media to remove the ammonia, so it's still out in your water column for a while, just kind of floating around. And from what we've observed, it takes very little ammonia to keep staghorn algae fed. And two, if you're running something like a hang-on back filter, which has room for chemical media, but the turnover is poor, the ammonia will be sitting in the tank for a long time before it's even removed, again, thus feeding staghorn algae for a short period of time. So it is an option, but it's much cleaner to just run RODI water. Alright, Mr. Smarty Pants, but what if your tap water doesn't have chloramines, but you still think there's an ammonia issue? Well, then we'd want to look at filtration and circulation. The first thing you'll want to look at is turnover. Now at ASG, we teach to have a filter that can turn over your tank's water volume 10 times every hour. This is why we're such huge fans of canister filters. Not only do they have high turnover, but they are generally able to move water around your tank better, which is referred to as circulation. And lastly, water moves through the filter media versus over it, like in some cases with hang-on back filters. So for turnover, a great example would be if you had a 20-gallon tank, you'd want a filter that turns over 200 gallons per hour. Most companies that sell filters will tell you what they rate the filter for, but you can ignore that as it's generally an inflated number. For example, Fluval says that their 307 canister filter is rated for 40 to 70 gallons. They are grossly overestimating what a filter can do. But what about the pump output number? Well, this number is what the pump can push on its own, not what it can push while attached to a canister filter, then filled with a ton of media. And then over time, that media gets gunked up, reducing flow. So it's always best to try to find the filter circulation over the pump output number, which if you divide that by 10, gives us 20.6, which means it's good for a 20.6 gallon tank. If the manufacturer only puts the pump output, you can remove roughly 30% off that output to estimate the filtration circulation after the media is installed. Oh man, did you know that ASG has developed its own mini canister? It's great for nano aquariums, like 2 to 8 gallons. Well, I should really say that the filter circulation should be able to push around 20 to 80 gallons per hour with its little adjustable pump. It's currently available for pre-order on our website, but as we do, we'll make a little official video kicking it off. I'll also toss down a little link in the description if you're curious and want to check it out. So let's say that you do have a canister that's pushing close to 10 times turnover per hour. The next thing that I would look at is how your filter is set up. We want our water to go through mechanical filtration first. We suggest you have the water go through a coarse to medium sponge first, then some filter floss. We love the filter floss because it'll make your water crystal clear. Then next it'll go through biomedia. It doesn't have to be anything special. We like ceramic rings, but you could also do something like Seachem Matrix if you want something fancy. And lastly, after the water's particulate matter and organics have been filtered out, the water would go through either chemical filtration when needed, or if not needed, just a bunch more biomedia and filter floss. Just as a side note, something like activated carbon isn't needed all the time, and in fact, it can remove heavy metals like iron, which our plants need, so you should really only run it when needed. Two things we want to note. We have a video on filtration and how to set up a canister properly. I'll put a link in the description below to that so you can check that out. Secondly, we have an article on ASG all about activated carbon and when to run it. I'll put a link to that as well. Lastly, circulation can sometimes be confused with turnover. Just because your canister is turning over 10 times your tank's water volume per hour doesn't mean that the water in your tank is being moved around in your tank in a way that brings plants fresh, clean, CO2 and nutrient-rich water. Now everyone's design is going to be a little different, but you want to position the inlet and outlet of your filter to ensure that water is being circulated around your tank. And if you have dead spots in your tank, this is where power heads can be a great idea, just to get the water into the corners and tight spaces within your tank. I generally start to see power heads being a good idea on tanks around 30 gallons or larger. Furthermore, if your design is really tall and tight, water gets blocked from circulating around the tank. So again, this is where a power head could help. Just something to keep in mind. We want to separate filtration and turnover with circulation. Okay, bud, so what if I don't have chloramines in my water? My canister filter is doing close to 10 times turnover per hour, and I still got staghorn. Well, the last thing we'll want to look at is your husbandry, which is how you maintain your tank on a weekly basis, because frankly, you should be doing water changes each week. So I would ask you what your water change schedule looks like, and how well are you siphoning out the rotting organic matter in your tank, like detritus. Now, when everything's happy and healthy, we normally recommend 50% water changes weekly. But in this case, we'd recommend upping the water changes to 75% weekly, for around 2 to 3 weeks roughly, or until the algae resolves itself. And as a reminder, we only suggest to do these large water changes so long as you don't have chloramines in your tap water. Otherwise, you're just putting ammonia back in the tank, right? And as stated, during these water changes, you want to make sure you're siphoning out as much junk, dead matter, and detritus as you can. We also suggest that with each water change, you siphon out parts of your substrate if you have an inert one. And if you have an aqua soil, try to gently siphon out the junk that has worked its way down into the soil. As when that stuff gets too out of control, it can release dissolved organic compounds, or DOCs as we call them. Now sometimes our tanks get so overgrown that it's almost impossible to siphon out the aqua soil. So the best time to do that is when we're changing up our scape. You're pulling all the plants and hardscape out. That's a great time to siphon out all the junk in your aqua soil before you start the new scape. Now with all this detritus, you'll find it between rocks, corners of your tank, and hiding in low flow areas. We want to remove everything that could be rotting in our tank, as it could be a source of ammonia in our water column. The whole idea with large water changes is to purge our system of any DOCs that might be building up over time. Just know that nitrates are not the only DOC that can build up on our tanks. This is why we don't teach the idea that if you have low nitrates, or they are not building up, you're okay to skip water changes. Because our tank is a closed system, nothing helps our tank more than clean, fresh water. Okay, smarty pants. So what if I don't have chloramines in my water? My filter's close to 10 times turnover per hour, and I'm great at removing all the dead stuff floating around in my tank and putting clean water back in. Well, the last thing that we'll want to look at is if there's any major changes that have been made recently to your design. Major changes to our design will always stress plants out, and plant stress will generally increase the chances of algae development. An example of some larger changes could be major swings in our GH, KH, or pH, or when we're running CO2 and then we stop. Or we get a new fancy light, we crank it all the way up to 11 and slap that bad boy on our tank. Even if some of these changes are for the better, all the old growth will still be used to how the tank was ran, and these new changes can stress the old growth out. How it presents itself in your tank is all the old growth will have Staghorn algae on its leaves, but the new growth will be super happy and squeaky clean of algae. You can visually see that the old growth is stressed, and the new growth is happy and buzzing like a bumblebee with a buzz cut, sipping on a latte. This is why we push for stability and consistency within our hobby. Even if things aren't 100% perfect, it's better to keep things consistent than going messing with the system every other day making changes. But let's say you did make a major change, even if it was for the positive. Like let's say you added CO2, or that new fancy Chihiros light, or maybe you're even dosing a new ASG fertilization kit. Guess what? Unfortunately, there is a chance that there could be some algae on the old growth as the new growth comes in all healthy. The only thing we can do at this point is be patient and trim out the really unhappy parts of our plant over time, allowing all the plant mass in our tank to turn over. This is one of the reasons we suggest running CO2. If you are running the full-blown ASG method, you'd be able to turn over your entire tank's plant mass within a few weeks, and your entire tank's back to happy again pretty quickly, versus not running CO2. When you run into issues like this, it's going to take months before your tank's looking happy again, unfortunately. All of this to say, we need to be mindful of the changes we are making, rebalance the system as needed, and give the tank time to react and level back out again. Alright, that's pretty much it for Staghorn algae. Let's do a quick little recap. Staghorn is lighter in color and looks kind of stiff and spiky when it's more mature. It's generally caused by a buildup of organics in our tank, which need to be mitigated with better filtration and circulation. In some cases, your tap water might have ammonia in it, so we'd suggest that you need to move over to an RODI unit, or maybe some chemical filtration. So long as the water that you're using for water changes doesn't have organics in it, then we'd suggest that you up your water change schedule to 75% weekly until the Staghorn subsides. Getting your organics down will either slow down or prevent the growth of Staghorn algae, allowing you to trim it out of your tank over time. Know that even if you do a dip solution like hydrogen peroxide or even like a bleach dip, it will not dissolve the algae and still might need to be manually removed or trimmed out. And lastly, we cannot stress this enough. As stated in the beginning, focus on making your plants super happy and they'll handle the algae for you. When plants are happy, they produce oleochemicals, which are a natural defense mechanism against algae. But they will only produce these chemicals when they are thriving. As they say though, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you're not currently running the ASG method, we would highly encourage you to take either our free online course called the ASG University, or at minimum, watch the Part 1 playlist on our YouTube channel. And hey, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out in the comments section. Like and subscribe to this video if it helped you, as that helps me out too. And lastly, share this video with others who are dealing with this pesky Staghorn algae. Okay, I got a ton more of these little algae videos to create, so I've got to go. But we'll see you in the next episode of the series, which will be on filamental algae. Alright, later scapers!